The morning Grace Whitfield walked into the land office at Caldwell, Kansas, she had exactly one coin in her coat pocket, a dead husband's name on her lips, and a plan that most sensible people would have called the longest shot in the entire state. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning over a cliff, drunk on cattle money and dust, and the constant howl of the southern wind. The town had grown fast and ugly, the way frontier towns tended to do, with saloons outnumbering churches 5-1, and the sound of fiddle music mixing with gunfire on Saturday nights. Grace had arrived on the morning stage from Wichita, her dark hair pinned under a worn felt hat, her dress the color of dried mud, not because she had no taste but because black dye cost money she did not have. She was 28 years old, which felt ancient some mornings and absurdly young on others, and she had been a widow for 7 months, which felt like a lifetime and like yesterday at the exact same time. Her husband, Thomas Whitfield, had filed a land claim on a parcel of ground 12 miles southeast of Caldwell back in the spring of 1877, just before the fever took him in August of that same year. The claim was 160 acres of shortgrass prairie, a modest creek running along its eastern boundary, a broken-down soddy the previous settler had abandoned, and more rattlesnakes per square yard than Grace cared to think about. Thomas had staked it under the Homestead Act of 1862, paid the $14 filing fee with money borrowed from his brother in Missouri, and then died before he could prove up on it. The law was very clear on what happened in that circumstance. The law was always very clear on what happened to widows. Grace had spent 7 months reading that law from every possible angle. She had read it in the dim light of the rented room she shared with her daughter, Lily, who was 6 years old and asked questions Grace could not always answer. She had written letters to a lawyer in Topeka, who had written back with words like, "unfortunately," and "however," and "you must understand." She had filed a formal inquiry with the General Land Office, which had responded with a document so densely worded it might as well have been written in a foreign language. And at the end of all that reading and letter writing and inquiring, she had arrived at one single, unlikely possibility. The coin in her pocket was an 1861 gold dollar, the kind they had stopped minting during the war. Thomas had kept it on a cord around his neck, a lucky piece his own father had given him, and Grace had taken it off his body herself on the morning he died. It was not legal tender for a land transaction in any conventional sense, but Grace had read, in the fine print of a Homestead Act amendment from 1876, a provision regarding claims where the original filer had died intestate and the surviving spouse had maintained continuous occupation of the property. The word continuous was the problem because Grace had not lived on the claim. She had been in Wichita working as a seamstress because the soddy had no roof to speak of and her daughter was 6 years old. But there was another provision, one even fewer people knew about, and that was the one Grace had come to discuss. The land office sat between a hardware store and a saloon, which struck Grace as an appropriate set of neighbors for a place that dealt in dreams and disappointment. The office itself was a narrow room with a plank floor and a counter running its full width, behind which stood shelves of leather-bound ledgers, a pair of surveying maps tacked to the wall, and a coal stove that was putting out entirely too much heat for an April morning. The smell was ink and dust, and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco. The man behind the counter was not the man Grace had been expecting. She had corresponded with a Mr. Harlan Stokes, the acting land agent, who had replied to her letters with the same tired patience a schoolteacher shows a student who keeps asking about recess. But Mr. Stokes was not present. The man standing behind the counter was tall, perhaps 35, with the kind of square jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, dark hair that was overlong and curling at the collar, and a deputy land commissioner's badge pinned to his vest that was slightly crooked, as though he had put it on in a hurry. He was bent over a ledger, making careful notes with a pen, and he did not look up when the door opened and Grace walked in. "I will be with you in a moment," he said, in a voice that was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who did not rush things. "I am here about the Whitfield claim," Grace said. She did not see any point in waiting. He looked up then. His eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the Kansas sky turns in the hour before a summer storm, and there was something in them, not hostility, not dismissal, but a kind of focused attention that Grace had not expected. Most of the men she had dealt with in official capacities over the past 7 months had looked at her with one of two expressions: pity or impatience. This man looked at her as though she had said something that genuinely interested him. "The Whitfield claim," he repeated. He set down his pen. "Thomas Whitfield, deceased, Southeast Parcel, Township 32. "That is correct," Grace said. "I am his widow. My name is Grace Whitfield." "Alfred Brooks," he said, and there was a brief pause in which neither of them moved. "Deputy Commissioner, Land District 9. I was sent down from Topeka 2 weeks ago to sort out a backlog of contested filings." "Mr. Stokes is ill." Another pause. "I am sorry about your husband, Mrs. Whitfield." "Thank you," Grace said, the way she always said it, with the efficiency of a phrase spoken so often it had worn smooth. "I would like to discuss the status of his claim." Alfred Brooks came around the counter and pulled a straight-back chair from against the wall, setting it in front of the counter with a gesture that was not quite formal and not quite casual. "Sit down if you would like," he said. "This may take a few minutes." Grace sat. She kept her coat on, which was partly because of the excessive heat from the stove, and partly because the coin was in the pocket, and she found herself wanting to keep it close. Alfred went back behind the counter and pulled a ledger from the middle shelf, the leather cover worn to a shine at the corners, and opened it to a page that was dense with small handwriting. He traced down the column with one finger, stopped, and read for a moment without speaking. "Your husband filed in April of 77, he said, paid the fee, began work on the improvements. Death recorded August of the same year." He looked up. "You were not present on the claim at the time of his death." "I was in Wichita," Grace said, "working. The soddy was not fit for winter habitation and I had a child to consider." "Where was your husband when he died?" "On the claim. He would not leave it." Grace's voice was flat. She had practiced this flatness. "He said someone had to stay, that if no one stayed they would lose the rights. He died in August before the first frost. He was not there because of the winter. He was there because he believed in it." Alfred looked back at the ledger. "The standard provision on abandoned claims is a 2-year contestation period, after which the land reverts to the public domain for refiling. By that calculation, you have until April of 1879 to establish a valid continuation of the original claim. However," he paused, "you have a competing interest, do you not? There is a notation here." He turned the ledger slightly. "Man named Calhoun filed an adjacent claim in October of 77 and has submitted a boundary dispute application that overlaps the Whitfield acreage by approximately 40 acres on the western edge." "I know about Mr. Calhoun," Grace said, and the way she said the name conveyed everything she thought about the man without her having to say any of it directly. "Then you understand the situation," Alfred said. "I understand the situation completely," Grace said. "That is why I am here." She reached into her coat pocket and placed the gold dollar on the counter between them. It was small and bright and entirely out of place in that room full of dust and paper, and the sound it made against the plank counter was soft and final, like a word spoken that cannot be taken back. Alfred looked at the coin. He did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Grace, and something shifted in his expression, some subtle rearrangement of the lines around his eyes and mouth. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said carefully, "the filing fee for a continuation claim is $14. "I know what the filing fee is," Grace said. "I also know what the revised statute of 1876, Section 42 of the amended Homestead Provisions, says about claims where a spouse has died in the act of improving the land." It says that in cases where the deceased filer was actively engaged in improvements at the time of death, and where the surviving spouse can demonstrate intent to continue, the land commissioner has discretionary authority to accept a symbolic tender as evidence of good faith while the formal documentation is assembled. The silence in the land office was the kind of silence that has texture to it. Outside, a horse shifted its weight on the hitching post. The coal stove ticked. "That statute," Alfred said slowly, "is not commonly invoked." "No," Grace agreed. "It is not, but it exists." He picked up the coin. He turned it over once, twice, looking at the date. He set it back down on the counter with the same care one might use with something that had sentimental value, and Grace noticed that he was thinking, genuinely thinking, not performing the motions of consideration while arriving at a predetermined answer. "I need to look at the full text of the statute," he said. "I have it," Grace said, and pulled a folded piece of paper from her other coat pocket. It was a copy she had made herself, in her own handwriting, from the bound copy of the revised statutes at the Wichita Public Library. Alfred unfolded it and read it with the same careful attention he had given the ledger, and Grace watched his face and tried to read what was happening behind those storm-colored eyes. "You have been living on the claim," he said without looking up from the paper. "I have been visiting the claim regularly," Grace said, choosing her words with the precision of someone who had thought about this. "I have made improvements. I have repaired the Soddy's south wall. I have cleared brush from the creek line. I have planted a kitchen garden." She paused. "My daughter and I spent 14 nights there last autumn. I have witnesses in Caldwell who saw us traveling the road." Visiting is not the same as continuous habitation. The statute does not require continuous habitation of the surviving spouse, Grace said. It requires demonstration of intent to continue. I am here, demonstrating intent. Alfred finally looked up from the paper. He was looking at her in a way that was different from before, not simply attentive, but something warmer and more complicated. Something that had to do, Grace thought, with the fact that she had just made a legal argument that was technically sound, and he knew it. "It also requires," he said, "that the land commissioner determine whether the claim has been materially abandoned, which means I need to inspect the property." "When can you inspect it?" Grace asked. "Thursday," he said almost immediately, which told her he had already decided something, though she could not yet be certain what. "I have 2 other properties in that township to review. I can include yours." "Then I will meet you there on Thursday," Grace said. She stood up and buttoned her coat. Alfred came around the counter again, and Grace was aware, in the way one is sometimes aware of things without looking directly at them, that he was taller than he had seemed behind the counter, and that he moved with the deliberate economy of a man who had spent time outdoors, not the shuffling indoor movement of a pure office man. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before, a kind of careful hesitation as though he were selecting the right words from a much larger available supply. "The Calhoun filing is not trivial. He has representation. A lawyer from Wichita, a man named Dupree. They will contest anything you submit." "I know," Grace said. "Then you should know that even if I find the claim valid and make a recommendation in your favor, Dupree can appeal through the district court. It could take months." "I know that too," Grace said. She picked up the coin from the counter and held it out to him. He took it, and for a moment their fingers were very close together without quite touching, and the morning sun coming through the single dirty window of the land office caught the gold in a way that made it briefly look like something more than what it was. "Keep it," she said, "as the symbolic tender. I believe that is how it works." Alfred closed his fingers around the coin. He was looking at her with that expression she could not quite name, the one that was not pity or impatience or any of the things she had come to expect. "Yes," he said, "that is how it works." Grace walked out of the land office and into the April sunshine of Caldwell, Kansas, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment with her eyes closed, listening to the sound of the town, the horses and the wind and the far-off hammer of someone building something, and she allowed herself to feel, just briefly, something she had not felt in 7 months. Not hope exactly. Something older and quieter than hope. Something closer to the stubbornness of growing things. The house where Grace was staying in Caldwell belonged to a woman named Mrs. Hattie Prout, who rented rooms to traveling women and was suspicious of everyone, but had a particular soft spot for children. Lily was sitting on the front porch steps with a corn-husk doll in her lap when Grace came up the road, and she jumped up with the immediate excitement of a 6-year-old who has been waiting and has excellent news to deliver. "Mrs. Prout has a cat," Lily said. "It is orange. She said I could pet it, but I cannot pick it up." "That seems fair," Grace said. She sat down on the steps beside her daughter, and Lily leaned against her, warm and small and smelling of the cornmeal porridge they had eaten for breakfast. "How did it go?" Lily asked, with the directness of a child who understood more than she should have had to understand at 6. "I think it went well," Grace said. "A man named Mr. Brooks is going to come and look at the land on Thursday. And then we can live there." Grace put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. The corn-husk doll had a twist of red thread for a mouth and 2 button eyes that did not quite match, and Lily held it with the serious tenderness of someone who had learned not to take small comforts for granted. "Maybe," Grace said, "if things go the way I hope they will." Lily considered this with the gravity appropriate to the question. "Papa believed in that land," she said. "I know he did," Grace said. "So do I." Thursday arrived with clouds in the west and the smell of coming rain, which in Kansas in April could mean anything from a light shower to something considerably more dramatic. Grace hired a horse from the livery for 2 bits, which she borrowed from Mrs. Prout against a week of mending, and rode out of Caldwell in the early morning, Lily sitting in front of her on the saddle. She found Alfred Brooks already at the claim when she arrived, standing at the edge of the creek in the morning light, his horse tied to the single cottonwood tree that stood on the property's eastern boundary. He had a surveying notebook in one hand and a compass in the other, and he turned when he heard her approach with the expression of a man who is genuinely glad to see someone, quickly adjusted into something more professionally appropriate. He helped Lily down from the horse with the careful competence of a man who had been around children without necessarily being related to any of them, which Lily apparently found acceptable because she immediately showed him the corn-husk doll and explained its name, which was Josephine, and its complete history, which took several minutes. Alfred listened to all of this with complete attention, and when Lily had finished he said, "Josephine is a fine name," with such sincerity that Lily beamed and went off to investigate the creek bank for interesting rocks, which was something she did wherever there was a creek bank available. Grace watched this small interaction and felt something turn over in her chest, soft and unexpected like a page. "You have children?" she asked, not meaning to say it quite so directly. "No," Alfred said, and there was nothing in his voice that suggested regret or relief, simply the plain fact of it. "I have a younger sister. She was Lily's age once. It was memorable." He said this dryly but with a warmth underneath. He turned to look at the soddy. "May I see the improvements you mentioned?" They walked the property together for the better part of 2 hours. The soddy was small, 2 rooms, the walls thick with cut sod that was dry and solid except for the south wall, which Grace had patched with fresh sod cut from the creek margin. Alfred noted this in his book without comment, but with the particular quality of attention that is itself a form of acknowledgement. The kitchen garden was in, just barely, the seedlings, the pale, optimistic green of things that have decided to exist in difficult conditions. The creek was clear and running strong with snowmelt, and along its banks the willows were putting out their first leaves, the soft, tentative yellow-green of very early spring. The western boundary was the problem, and they both knew it. The stakes that marked the Whitfield claim's western edge had been moved. It was not subtle about it. The original stakes, driven by Thomas Whitfield in April of 1877, had been pulled and reset approximately 40 feet to the east, with new stakes that were noticeably less weathered. Alfred crouched down and examined one of the new stakes, and then looked across the open ground toward where the Calhoun property began. "He moved them," Grace said, standing beside him with her arms crossed over her chest. "Someone moved them," Alfred said carefully, which was the legally accurate version of the same thing. "Calhoun has been running cattle on that 40 acres since November," Grace said. "I have letters from 2 neighbors who saw it." Alfred stood up and looked at her. "You have letters?" "I have spent 7 months preparing for this conversation," Grace said. "Yes, I have letters." For the first time, she saw something that was unmistakably a smile pass across Alfred Brooks's face. It was brief and controlled, the smile of a man who found the world frequently frustrating but occasionally surprising, and right now he was in the territory of the latter. He wrote something in his notebook and then looked out across the property, the whole of it, the soddy and the garden and the creek and the wide flat spread of short grass prairie with the western sky behind it going the color of hammered pewter where the clouds were building. "I am going to be honest with you, Mrs. Whitfield," he said, still looking at the land. "Please," Grace said. "What you have here is a valid claim. The statute you cited is real, and your interpretation of it is technically sound. The symbolic tender was lawful, and the improvements you have made, including this garden and that wall, constitute demonstrable intent to continue. In a straightforward situation, I would write my recommendation today and the claim would be yours within 60 days. But it is not a straightforward situation," Grace said. "Calhoun has a lawyer and a boundary dispute filing and, I suspect, a friendly relationship with at least one member of the District Land Board in Wichita," Alfred said. "He is the kind of man who knows which palms to grease and has the money to do it." Grace said nothing. The wind came across the prairie and moved through the long grass with a sound like breathing. "What I am going to do," Alfred said, turning to face her, "is write the most thorough and legally airtight property inspection report that this district has ever seen. Every stake, every measurement, every improvement, every letter you have in that packet, all of it documented and attached. And then I am going to file it through the Commissioner's office in Topeka directly, bypassing the Wichita Board entirely, because I have the authority to do so in cases involving clear boundary fraud, which this is." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she asked, not suspiciously but with genuine curiosity, the kind that wants to understand a thing rather than simply receive it. Alfred met her eyes. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because your husband died improving this land and you have spent 7 months fighting for it with one coin and a legal argument that most lawyers would not have found, and if the law cannot protect that, then the law is not worth much." Grace felt the back of her throat tighten in the way it did when she was trying not to let her face show what she was feeling. She had learned that tightening over the past 7 months, had cultivated it as a kind of armor, and she was grateful for it now because what she felt in that moment was large and complicated and not entirely appropriate to feel about a man she had known for 4 days. "Thank you," she said. It was not the smooth, worn version of the phrase she used when people offered her condolences. It was the real one, with all its weight intact. They spent another hour walking the property, and Alfred was meticulous in his documentation, measuring and noting and sketching with the focused efficiency of someone who took the work seriously because the work mattered. Lily reappeared periodically from the creek bank, each time with more rocks in her pockets, and at some point Alfred helped her identify a piece of fossilized shell, a flat round thing with a spiral pattern, which he told her was very old, from a time when the whole of the Kansas plains had been the floor of a shallow sea. Lily received this information with the reverence due to something wonderful and held the fossil for the rest of the afternoon with both hands. They were walking back to the horses, the light going golden in the late afternoon, when the trouble arrived. It came in the form of 2 men on horseback, crossing the open ground from the direction of the Calhoun property, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of men who believe they are in the right. The one in front was broad-shouldered and florid-faced, wearing a hat that had been expensive once, and Grace recognized him immediately. Silas Calhoun was 41 years old, had a cattle operation 3 miles north and had been trying to acquire the Whitfield claim since September of 1877. He was not a subtle man. He was the kind of man who considered directness and aggression to be synonymous, and who had enough money and enough allies that this approach had served him tolerably well for most of his life. The man behind him was younger and harder looking, with the narrow eyes of someone who did his thinking slowly and held his conclusions tightly once he reached them. Grace did not know his name, but she recognized the type. Calhoun pulled up 10 feet away and looked at Alfred, not at Grace. "Brooks," he said. It was not a greeting. "Mr. Calhoun," Alfred said. His voice had not changed at all. He stood with his hands at his sides and his notebook under one arm with the easy steadiness of a man who was not going to be hurried or intimidated by a man on a horse. "I'm conducting a routine property inspection." "On my land," Calhoun said. "On the Whitfield claim, which is the parcel under review," Alfred said, "as listed in the district ledger." "The Whitfield claim is abandoned and in contestation," Calhoun said. "You know that as well as I do. The woman has no standing here." "That determination has not been made," Alfred said, "which is why I am here to make it." Calhoun's eyes finally moved to Grace, and they carried in them the flat certainty of a man who has decided how a thing will end and cannot quite understand why the world has not caught up with his decision. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, with a courtesy that was not courtesy, "I have made you a fair offer, several of them. The land is not worth what you seem to think it is." "The land is worth exactly what I think it is," Grace said, "which is why I have not accepted any of your offers." Calhoun's jaw tightened. "The boundary filing stands. My lawyer will have it confirmed in Wichita within the month." "That filing is being reviewed for evidence of fraud," Alfred said, still in that unmoved voice. "Specifically, the unauthorized relocation of original survey stakes, which constitutes a federal offense under the Land Management Act. I would recommend you speak with your lawyer about that before he files anything further." The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Calhoun stared at Alfred for a long moment, and Alfred looked back at him with the particular calm of a man who is not performing calm, but who genuinely has nothing to be afraid of. Calhoun was bigger and louder and richer, and none of that mattered because Alfred Brooks had a legal argument that was correct and both men knew it. Calhoun turned his horse without another word and rode back the way he had come, his companion following. Grace watched them go and breathed slowly through her nose until the tightness in her chest eased. "Thank you," she said again, quieter this time. "He will still make trouble," Alfred said. "He is not a man who concedes gracefully." "No," Grace agreed. "But he is also not used to dealing with someone who has read the statutes." Alfred looked at her sidelong with that almost smile. "No," he said, "I do not think he is." Lily reappeared from behind the cottonwood tree where she had sensibly retreated when the men rode up, fossil clutched to her chest, eyes very wide. "Were those bad men?" she asked. "One of them was," Grace said, "but it is handled." Lily looked at Alfred with the direct appraisal of a child who does not yet understand that staring is considered rude. "You talked very calmly," she said, with what sounded like professional admiration. "It is usually more effective than shouting," Alfred said. "In my experience," Lily considered this. "Papa used to shout sometimes," she said, and then looked at her fossil, and Grace put her hand briefly on her daughter's shoulder. And the three of them stood for a moment in the late afternoon light with the prairie wind moving around them, and the Whitfield land spread out in every direction, quiet and stubborn and full of possibility. Alfred rode beside Grace on the road back to Caldwell, as the clouds in the west finally made good on their promise and began to produce a slow, steady rain. They rode without speaking for a while in the comfortable way that sometimes happens between two people who have spent a full day together and have moved past the self-conscious stage into something easier. Lily had fallen asleep against Grace's chest, still holding the fossil, her small weight warm and absolute. "How long have you been in Caldwell?" Grace asked eventually, because she found that she wanted to know things about him and was not entirely sure what to do with that wanting. 2 weeks, as I said," Alfred replied. I expect to be here another month, perhaps 6 weeks. There is a considerable backlog. And after, back to Topeka, I suppose. Or wherever the next assignment takes me. Grace nodded. The rain was light and fine, more mist than rain, and it softened the edges of the prairie landscape into something that looked almost gentle. You are not from Kansas originally, she said. It was not a question. Ohio, he said. I went west to study law when I was 22 and ended up in government work instead. A pause. It suits me, I think. I am better with land than I am with courtrooms. Why is that? Land does not argue, he said. It is what it is. The arguments are all between people, but the land itself is honest. He glanced at her. Where are you from originally? Illinois, Grace said. Thomas and I came west in '74. He had the idea that there was still room for something new here. She looked out at the rain-gray prairie. He was not wrong. No, Alfred said quietly. He was not. They arrived in Caldwell as the lamplighter was making his rounds, and Alfred dismounted at the livery and helped Grace down without Lily waking. He held the sleeping child with a kind of careful competence while Grace untacked the horse. And watching him stand there in the lamplight with her daughter against his shoulder was, Grace thought later, one of those moments that slips under your defenses before you have time to construct them properly. I will have the inspection report completed by Monday, he said, handing Lily back with the same care. I will send you a copy before I file it. I would appreciate that, Grace said. He held her gaze for a moment in the yellow lamplight, and the rain came down in its fine mist around them. And Alfred Brooks said, "Good evening, Mrs. Whitfield," in a voice that managed to be professional and warm at the same time, which Grace thought was a remarkable thing to accomplish with 3 words. She carried Lily back to Mrs. Pruitt's house through the quiet rain and put her daughter to bed, and then sat at the small table in their room with the lamp burning and looked at her hands for a long time. They were seamstress hands, small and calloused, with ink stains on the right forefinger from all the letters she had written and all the statutes she had copied. Thomas had had farmer's hands, broad and rough, and she had loved them very much. These were not Thomas's hands. These were her own. She was not sure exactly what she was thinking about. She was quite sure it was not entirely about the land claim, and she was also sure that it was too soon, and she was also sure that the heart does not keep a calendar, which was an inconvenient truth she had been attempting to ignore for about 3 days. The report arrived on Saturday, not Monday, and it was, as Alfred had promised, the most comprehensive property inspection document Grace had ever seen. It was 14 pages long, handwritten in Alfred's precise, readable script, with measurements and legal citations, and 3 separate surveys of the boundary stakes with detailed notes on the evidence of their relocation. Attached were copies of the 2 neighbor letters Grace had provided, along with 3 additional affidavits Alfred had apparently collected on his own, from a Caldwell hardware merchant who had sold Grace the sod cutter, a farmer who had seen her working the creek line in November, and the stage driver who had brought her to Caldwell on the morning of their first meeting. Grace read the whole thing twice at the kitchen table, while Mrs. Pruitt pretended not to be watching her from across the room. When she finished reading the second time, she looked up and found Mrs. Pruitt looking at her with an expression that was not quite sympathetic and not quite approving, but was something that partook of both. "That is a thorough piece of work," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Yes," Grace said. "The man who wrote it went to some trouble," Mrs. Pruitt said. "Yes," Grace said again. Mrs. Pruitt returned to her sewing. Grace folded the report carefully and held it in her hands and thought about a man who collected 3 extra affidavits on his own time because it was the right thing to do. She went to the land office the next morning, which was a Sunday, and the office was of course closed. She stood in front of it for a moment feeling faintly foolish, and then went home and wrote Alfred a letter instead, which she intended to be brief and professional, and which became, over the course of 4 drafts, something rather more personal than she had planned. She kept the final version to 2 paragraphs, but they were, she thought, honest paragraphs. Alfred's response came on Tuesday and was also 2 paragraphs, but was warmer than she had expected. And between the lines of his careful professional language, she could feel the same thing she had tried to contain in her own letter. The fact that something was happening between them that was larger and stranger and more insistent than a land claim. The weeks that followed had a quality to them that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, the particular quality of a spring in which everything is growing all at once, and the light lasts longer every day, and the world is visibly and rapidly becoming different from what it was before. She worked on the claim every day that the weather permitted, taking the hired horse out at dawn and working until the middle of the afternoon, when she would collect Lily from Mrs. Prout's and bring her out to help plant, to explore, to do the 10,000 small things that transform a piece of ground from property into home. She patched the second room of the soddy and replaced 2 crumbling wall sections, and hung the door that had been leaning against the outside wall, since Thomas had died before he could hang it himself. She planted beans and squash and 2 rows of corn, and she coaxed the creek line clear of fallen branches and built a small timber dam that improved the water flow to the kitchen garden. Alfred came to the claim 3 more times during those weeks, always for stated professional reasons that were entirely legitimate. And on each of those visits, they talked the way people talk when they have found something rare in each other, openly and at length, about the land and the law and the way the West was changing, about Ohio and Illinois, and the particular smell of the prairie in May, about Lily's fossils and Alfred's legal education, and what Thomas had believed about this land, and what Grace believed about it now. They talked until the light went amber and late, and it was time to ride back. And on the road back they continued talking, and there was between them a growing warmth that was patient and deep, and entirely unlike the sudden bright flares of feeling that Grace associated with younger, easier times. This was something that had grown up out of hard ground, and those are the things that last. It was on the third of these visits, in mid-May, with the claim's kitchen garden in full optimistic growth, and the creek running clear, and the prairie covered with the small yellow flowers that come every spring whether anyone is watching or not, that Alfred said something that was not professional at all. They were sitting on the bank of the creek where an old cottonwood had fallen years ago and made a natural seat, and Lily had gone up to the soddy to check on the corn seedlings she had appointed herself guardian of, and the afternoon light was the kind that makes everything look as though it were painted with gold. "I find myself," Alfred said, not looking at her, looking at the water, looking forward to these visits rather more than is strictly professional. Grace was quiet for a moment. A red-winged blackbird sang from somewhere in the willows. "I find myself looking forward to them too," she said, "which also is not strictly professional. Considering that you are the man deciding the fate of my land claim." "I have already filed the report," he said. "The decision has been made in Topeka. It is no longer mine to make." "And what did Topeka decide?" He looked at her then, and there was something in his face that was careful and bright at the same time. "The claim is valid," he said. "The boundary fraud finding was upheld. Calhoun's application was denied and the original survey stakes have been ordered restored. The deed is being processed." He paused. "You should receive the official notification by the end of the month," Grace breathed. In and then out slowly, with the whole prairie around her and the creek running and the late spring light on everything. She had won. After 7 months of reading statutes in rented rooms and writing letters and riding out to a broken soddy to plant kitchen gardens in difficult ground, she had won. "Thank you," she said, and it was the real version again with all its weight. "You won it yourself," Alfred said, and he meant it entirely. "I only documented what was already true." "That is not nothing," Grace said. "Documenting what is true, plenty of people did not bother." He was looking at her with that expression she had spent weeks learning to read, the one that was careful and warm and held something behind it that he was choosing his moment to say. "Grace," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the Mrs. Whitfield, and the way he said it, quietly, as though he had been carrying it around for a while, made her chest ache in a way that was not grief. "I am in Caldwell for another 2 weeks, and then I will very likely be sent somewhere else." He stopped, started again. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I do not want to say something you will not welcome. I'm a woman who spent 7 months reading federal statutes in a rented room," Grace said. "I have very little patience left for things that beat around the subject." He almost laughed at that, a real laugh, quiet and genuine. And then he said, "I would very much like to continue knowing you, after the assignment ends, if you would permit it." Grace looked at the creek, at the yellow flowers on the bank, at the patch of sky between the cottonwood branches that was the precise blue of a good day. She thought about Thomas, about the way grief worked, the way it did not simply end but became part of the landscape of a person, something you moved through rather than something you left behind. She thought about Lily and her fossils and her corn seedlings and the way she had looked at Alfred standing in the lamplight with her asleep on his shoulder. She thought about the coin, the 1861 gold dollar, sitting on the counter of the land office, catching the light. "I would permit it," she said, "more than permit it." Alfred reached out and covered her hand with his, and it was a careful, unhurried gesture, the kind that asks rather than assumes, and Grace turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that on the fallen cottonwood with the creek running over its smooth stones and the prairie going gold around them. Lily came running from the direction of the soddy a few minutes later, very excited about the state of the corn, and stopped short when she saw the two of them sitting on the cottonwood log with their hands joined, and stood looking at them with her head tilted and her fossil in her pocket and the shrewd assessment of a child who sees clearly. "Are you two friends now?" she asked. "Yes," Alfred said. "I think we are." Lily considered this. "Good," she said, with the finality of a verdict, and went to look for interesting rocks. The official notification from the Land Commissioner's office in Topeka arrived on May 28, 1878, in a brown envelope with a federal seal, addressed to Mrs. Grace Whitfield. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper, typed rather than handwritten, bearing the official language of the government, the tract number and the township and the range and the words patent deed, and full title and right, and the name Thomas Whitfield, deceased, and beneath it the name Grace Whitfield as continuing heir and claimant, and at the bottom a signature and a date and a seal that was round and gold and very official. Grace read it standing at the front door of Mrs. Pruitt's house, with the morning light coming in and Lily eating porridge at the table behind her. She read it twice. She folded it and pressed it against her chest for a moment, not performing a motion but genuinely feeling something she could not have put into words and did not need to. "Is that it?" Lily asked. "That is it," Grace said. "The land is ours." Lily put down her spoon and came to the door and pressed herself against Grace's side, and Grace put her arm around her daughter's thin shoulders, and they stood in the doorway looking out at Caldwell, at the dusty Main Street, and the horses and the blue prairie sky above everything, and Grace thought that Thomas would have been glad, not only because of the land, but because she had fought for it. Because she had gone into that office with one coin and a legal argument, and had walked out with something nobody had expected her to have, because she had not let the weight of the world stop her from growing. Silas Calhoun did not, as Alfred had predicted, concede gracefully. He appealed the Topeka finding through the Wichita District Board in June, and his lawyer, the man Dupree, submitted a formal contestation that alleged irregularities in the inspection process. It was, as Alfred described it when he told Grace about it over the counter of the land office on the morning the appeal papers arrived, a last-ditch effort that had very little legal merit but would cause a delay of several months. "How many months?" Grace asked. 3, possibly 4, Alfred said. "Dupree will argue procedural issues. He cannot challenge the substance of the finding. It is too solid, but he can slow it down." "Can Calhoun continue to run cattle on the disputed 40 acres while the appeal is pending?" "No," Alfred said firmly. "The preliminary injunction I filed prevents any use of the property during the contestation period." Grace nodded. 3 or 4 months was manageable. She was on the claim now, or at least in the process of getting there. She had given notice to Mrs. Prout, who had expressed what Grace suspected was genuine regret behind the facade of her customary suspicion, and had hired a local carpenter to help repair the soddy's roof before summer. The garden was producing. The creek was running. The land was hers in everything but the finalized piece of paper, and in the meantime she had the preliminary deed and the Topeka letter and Alfred's report, and she had the knowledge that the law, when you knew how to read it, could sometimes be made to work the way it was supposed to. Alfred's assignment in Caldwell had officially ended in early June, but he had not left, which was a fact he had explained to his supervisor in Topeka as a function of the unresolved Calhoun appeal requiring continued on-site oversight, which was technically true and also not entirely the reason. Grace had moved to the claim in the first week of June, she and Lily, in a rented wagon with their possessions packed into a single trunk and 3 crates. The soddy was not comfortable. It was never going to be comfortable in the way a house with proper walls and a real roof and a board floor was comfortable. But it was solid and dry, and the kitchen garden was there, and the creek was there, and the wide unobstructed sky was there, and Lily treated the whole arrangement as an adventure of the most magnificent kind. She found 7 new fossils in her first 2 weeks and arranged them on the window ledge in order of size. Alfred came on Saturdays, which became the shape of the week. Grace noticed that she began to measure time by them. The weekdays were work and planting and the ordinary heroism of building something, and Saturdays were the creek bank and the long conversations, and the particular way the afternoon light fell on Alfred's face when he was listening to something she said. He helped with things that needed 2 people. He and Grace working together to dig and set the timber posts for a proper fence line along the eastern boundary, fitting the rails with the easy rhythm of 2 people who had learned each other's working pace. He brought books sometimes, from the town library or from his own limited but interesting collection, and they read in the evenings by lamplight while Lily slept, and discussed what they had read, and Grace found in those discussions a pleasure she had not known in years, the pleasure of being thought by someone capable of thought. He was not replacing Thomas. She had thought about this carefully, turning it over in her mind the way she turned the important things, and she had arrived at the understanding that that was not what was happening. Thomas was Thomas, irreplaceable and loved, and what they had built together was real and mattered and still lived in her, and in Lily and in the land itself. Alfred was Alfred, different in all the ways a different person is different, and what was growing between them was its own thing, new and particular, and it did not require the old thing to be diminished for the new thing to be real. She told him this, one Saturday evening in July, sitting on the front step of the soddy with the summer stars beginning to appear overhead and the sound of the cicadas rising from the grass. She told him because she thought he had been wondering, had been careful with her in a way that spoke of his awareness of the ground they were navigating, and she wanted him to stop being careful in that particular way, the way that held back. She wanted him to know that it was all right to be here fully, without the careful holding back. He listened to all of it with the attention that was characteristic of him, and when she finished, he sat for a long moment with his elbows on his knees and looked at the stars. Then he turned and looked at her with the full weight of what he felt, not managed or calibrated but plain and direct, the way a man looks at someone when he is done being careful. "I think," he said, "that I have been in love with you since you put that coin on my counter and started citing federal statutes." Grace laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly and sounds like itself without any performance. "That is a very specific moment," she said. "It was a very specific moment," he agreed. She leaned toward him and he met her halfway, the way things that have been moving toward each other eventually must. And when he kissed her, it was nothing like the careful man she had come to know and everything like him at the same time, gentle and unhurried and entirely present. and the summer stars came out overhead one by one, and the cicadas kept singing, and the Kansas night settled around them like a blanket. July moved into August, and the crops came in strong, better than Grace had dared hope for, and she and Lily and Alfred spent 3 days in the long August heat harvesting corn and beans and squash, and stacking it in the cool back room of the soddy. The kitchen garden had exceeded all reasonable expectations, and Grace credited this to the creek irrigation and the quality of the soil, which was the rich dark prairie loam that Kansas was famous for, and also to Lily, who had appointed herself official guardian of the garden and took the role with a seriousness that seemed to have had a measurable effect on the vegetables. The Calhoun appeal was denied in September. The notice came from the Wichita District Board, curt and official, sustaining the Topeka finding in full. Dupree had filed the procedural challenges Alfred had predicted, and they had been reviewed and found without merit. And the final deed, the actual patent deed with the federal seal and the complete legal language, arrived in a brown envelope in the second week of September, 1878, 5 months after Grace had walked into the Caldwell land office with a coin and a copied statute. She held the deed on the front step of the soddy in the September morning light, the stubbled corn field behind her and the creek visible between the cottonwoods, the sky the enormous blue that only September can produce, and she felt Thomas in it somehow, not in the grief way but in the good way, the way of knowing he would have understood exactly what this moment cost and what it was worth. Calhoun sold his operation north of Caldwell that winter and left the county, which everyone agreed was for the best. The man Dupree went back to Wichita and was reportedly not heard from again in those parts. The boundary stakes were restored to their original positions, verified and recorded, and the 40 acres that Calhoun had tried to steal sat within the Whitfield claims boundaries with the clear finality of a legal settlement. Alfred's request to be transferred to the Land Commissioner's regional office in Caldwell, rather than reassigned to Topeka, was submitted in October and approved in November. It was not the most prestigious posting available to a man with his credentials and experience, and his supervisor in Topeka had told him as much, and Alfred had said that he was aware of that, and that his reasons were personal, and he would submit the request in writing, which he did, with the same meticulous precision he brought to everything. He had asked Grace something important on a Saturday evening in early October, when the harvest was done, and the air had turned the sharp golden cold of the Kansas autumn, sitting on the fallen cottonwood by the creek as they had done many times before. He had not been particularly artful about it, being a man who dealt in direct language, and Grace had not required artfulness, being a woman who had spent 7 months reading federal statutes and could tell a direct and honest thing from any other kind. He had said simply, "I would like to marry you, Grace, if you will have me, not because of the claim or the land or any practical consideration, but because I cannot imagine the Saturdays without you and I have no wish to try." And Grace had said yes, with equal directness and considerably more feeling, and held his face in both her hands in the autumn dark, and felt the whole length of the year behind her, the grief and the fighting and the reading and the riding out to broken soddies in the cold, and felt it resolve, not erase, but resolve, the way a long, complex piece of music resolves at the end into something that contains all that came before it. They were married in December of 1878 by the Methodist minister in Caldwell, in a small ceremony attended by Mrs. Prute, whose expression managed to convey both disapproval and approval simultaneously, a remarkable feat, and the farmer couple from the neighboring claim to the north, who had come to know Grace well over the summer and who brought a jar of wild plum preserves as a gift, and the hardware merchant who had sold Grace the sod cutter and who shook Alfred's hand with the solemn approval of a man certifying a business transaction. Lily wore a dress Grace had sewn from blue calico and stood very straight throughout the ceremony, and held the fossil in her pocket during the vows because she had decided it was good luck. The reception afterward was held at Mrs. Pruitt's, which was warm and smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and at some point during the evening Lily fell asleep in Alfred's lap while the adults talked around her, and Alfred sat very still so as not to wake her, one hand resting on her small back, and Grace looked at them from across the room and felt something so full and complete it was almost difficult to contain. The winter was a working winter and a good one. Alfred built a proper floor in the soddy, plank boards hauled from Caldwell in the wagon, and they built together a second room with proper cut timber walls inside the sod, so that the main living space was warm and tight. They ordered a parlor stove from a Wichita catalog, and it arrived in January, and the first night it was installed and burning Lily sat in front of it with her fossils arranged on the floor around her, and pronounced it the best stove she had ever seen, which was generous given that she had seen relatively few. Alfred read aloud in the evenings, the Bible sometimes and sometimes novels, and sometimes the legal texts he was required to keep current with, and Grace sewed and mended and listened, and sometimes asked questions that led to the kind of conversations that made the winter nights feel like a luxury. They planted in March, before the last frosts were quite done with the Prairie, because Grace had learned in her first year that the Kansas season was shorter than it looked, and the extra days at either end mattered. Alfred worked the fields alongside her with the thoroughness he brought to everything, which was considerable. He was not a farmer born, but he was a quick learner and more importantly a persistent one, and by the time May came around, he could read the soil and the sky with the beginning of the instinct that takes years to fully develop. In May of 1879, a year after the coin had gone down on the counter of the Caldwell Land Office, Grace told Alfred she was expecting a child. They were at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp burning between them and the sound of the Prairie evening coming through the window, and she said it plainly, the way she said important things, and Alfred sat very still for a moment and then crossed the small room and held her and did not say anything for a long while, and did not need to. The baby came in December of 1879, a boy, arriving in the soddy in a December snowstorm with the help of the neighbor woman from the next claim and a midwife who had ridden out from Caldwell in the snow, and he was healthy and loud, and had Alfred's gray-green eyes from the first day, which Lily found both interesting and slightly suspicious, as though the eyes were evidence of something she had not quite worked out yet. They named him Thomas, which was Grace's idea, and Alfred had received the suggestion with a quiet thoughtfulness that told Grace he understood everything it meant and meant to say. Thomas Alfred Brooks was a large and opinionated infant who grew into an equally large and opinionated toddler, and Lily, who had been an only child for 7 years, adapted to his presence with the pragmatic generosity of someone who has learned that the world does not stay the same shape and that this is not necessarily a bad thing. She taught him the names of his fossils before he could walk, holding each one up for his inspection with the gravity of a professor, and Thomas regarded them with the wide-eyed attention of a child who does not yet understand words but recognizes importance. The claim grew with them, as claims do when the people working them are serious and stubborn, and in love with the land they are building on. Alfred filed for an additional homestead parcel in the spring of 1880, the 160 acres adjacent to the Whitfield claim on the north side, which brought the total property to 320 acres of creek-watered shortgrass prairie. They brought in cattle that spring, a modest start, 12 head, and built a proper barn of cut timber and sod with a real roof, the smell of new wood and hay and animal warmth, one of the best smells Grace had ever encountered. They added a chicken coop and a smokehouse. They planted an orchard of 12 fruit trees along the south fence line, apple and peach and 1 pear, knowing they would not see the full fruit of the planting for years, and planting them anyway, because that is how you build something that outlasts you. Lily turned 8 in the spring of 1880 and was enrolled in the school that had opened in Caldwell the previous fall, taught by a young woman from Ohio named Miss Carter, who took Lily's interest in fossils seriously and introduced her to the works of a geologist named John Strong Newberry, which was the beginning of a passion that would direct the entire course of her life, though none of them could have known that yet. Lily rode to school on a small bay pony Alfred had traded for with considerable skill, and she carried her school books and her fossil collection, and moved through the world with the particular confidence of a child who has been allowed to matter, to ask questions that get taken seriously, to believe that the world is large and she belongs in it. The summer of 1880 was a dry one, the worst the county had seen in several years, and it tested everyone in the way that drought tests the particular quality of a person's stubbornness. The creek dropped to half its usual flow, the corn came in thin, and the cattle required supplemental feed they had not budgeted for. Grace and Alfred sat at the kitchen table in the evenings that summer and worked the numbers together, the way you work numbers when they are tight and every figure matters, and they adjusted and economized and made what they had stretch, and there were weeks that were harder than they admitted to each other at the time, though they admitted it later. But the orchard survived, drawing water from deep roots, and the kitchen garden survived, fed by the reduced but still present creek, and the cattle made it through, lean but healthy. And in the fall of 1880 Grace realized she was expecting again and told Alfred at the kitchen table with the lamp between them just as she had before, and he held her just as he had before, and outside the Kansas prairie waited for the rain that would come again in spring. The second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1881, the season of returning moisture and new grass and the loud optimistic return of the prairie birds. They named her Clara, after Alfred's mother, who had died when he was young, and who he had told Grace about one winter evening in the soft way people tell stories that have become part of the furniture of who they are. Clara was small and brown-haired and quiet, very different from Thomas's large and noisy presence, and regarded the world from her first days with the considering expression of someone who is taking careful notes. Thomas was 18 months old when Clara arrived and adjusted to her presence by treating her as a very small, interesting object that could be rolled slowly around the floor, which required supervision, but demonstrated an essentially benign curiosity. Lily, who was 9 and increasingly a person of intellectual preoccupations, appointed herself head of the educational committee for the younger children, with an authority that no one had officially granted her, but that everyone, including the children themselves, seemed to accept. By 1882, the Brooks claim, which was what people called it now, though the original deed still read Whitfield and Grace had decided to leave it that way, was a working cattle and grain operation with a real farmhouse, the soddy having been supplemented by a timber-framed addition that gave them 4 rooms, a proper parlor and a kitchen and 2 bedrooms, with real windows and a board floor throughout, and a covered porch on the south side where you could sit in the evenings and watch the light leave the prairie. Alfred had been promoted within the Land Commissioner's office to Regional Deputy Inspector for District 9, which meant he spent 3 days a week in Caldwell at the district office, and the rest of the week on the claim or in the field. It was good work he believed in, because the land questions of western Kansas were not simple, and the answers mattered to real people in real ways, and Alfred had a talent for finding the honest answer and the courage to say it plainly, which was rarer than it should have been in that business. Grace ran the farm with the same systematic intelligence she had brought to the legal argument that started it, managing the cattle operation and the grain planting, and the seasonal hiring of additional hands, with a competence that the neighboring farmers had stopped being surprised by and had come to simply accept as part of the landscape, the way you accept the creek and the prevailing wind as features of the territory. She kept books that were precise and clear and bought and sold at the right times, and in 1882 they paid off the timber debt from the house addition ahead of schedule, which she noted in the farm ledger with the same careful penmanship she used for everything, and which Alfred considered one of the finest entries he had ever read. There were still hard days. Drought came and went on the plains in cycles that did not ask your permission, and there were hard winters and sick cattle and seasons that did not produce what you had planned for. There was the morning in 1883 when a grass fire came out of the southwest, and they fought it for 6 hours with wet sacking and plow lines before it turned. And Grace and Alfred came inside that night with black hands and exhausted eyes and sat together at the kitchen table without speaking for a long time, just being in the same room, which was sometimes what you needed. There were the ordinary sorrows of frontier life, the neighbor woman who died in childbirth, the drought that took 3 farms in the county in 1885, the winter cold that took 2 of the cattle before they got the barn properly insulated. Each of these things was real and hard and left its mark, as real hard things do. But the marks were accompanied by other marks, the good kind, the ones that accumulate into a life. Lily winning a prize at the county school exhibition for a paper on Kansas geology that Miss Carter helped her write, and that the judges, 2 of them farmers who could not have defined geology if pressed, recognized as the work of a remarkable mind. Thomas's first steps, taken on the porch one September morning in the direction of a yellow dog that belonged to the neighbors, and his subsequent inability to be separated from that dog, which eventually came to live with them with the neighbors' resigned blessing. Clara's first words, which were not mama or papa but bird, spoken with precision and considerable satisfaction, pointing at a meadowlark on the fence post. Alfred reading to Grace in the evenings, the lamp between them, Thomas and Clara asleep and Lily bent over her school books at the other end of the table. The Saturdays that were no longer shaped by anything except their own choosing, free to be what they were, morning chores and afternoon walks along the creek and evenings on the porch with the summer stars or the winter quiet. The way Alfred looked at Grace across the kitchen in the morning, over coffee, with the complete openness of a man who has been loved well and knows it, and does not take it for granted. The gold coin came back into the story in a way none of them had expected. In the summer of 1882, Alfred was reorganizing the filing boxes at the district land office, clearing out the accumulated paper of 4 years, and he found it at the back of the drawer where he had placed it in April of 1878, still bright, still clear, the date 1861 still legible on its face. He brought it home that Saturday and set it on the kitchen table, and Grace picked it up and turned it over in her hands and felt the whole weight of it. The cord around Thomas's neck, the morning he died, the rented room in Wichita, the 7 months of statutes, the morning she had walked into the office and put it down on the counter. She felt all of it, and it was not grief, or rather it was grief made into something else through time and work and love, the way hard things sometimes transform, not into softness exactly but into something bearable, something that has its own meaning. "What do you want to do with it?" Alfred asked. Grace thought about it for a moment and then went to the window where Lily's fossils still lived on the sill, 8 of them now, arranged by Lily's ongoing system of classification. She set the coin at the end of the row, the gold bright among the gray stones. "Leave it there," she said, "with the rest of the things that matter." Alfred came to stand beside her and looked at the windowsill with its collection of fossils and 1 gold coin, and the light coming through the glass onto all of it. "Thomas's coin," he said quietly. "It was not a question." "Yes," Grace said, "and ours too in a way. It is where this started." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood at the window looking at the coin, and the fossils and the prairie beyond the glass. And the afternoon was still and clear and very large, the way the prairie afternoon can be when you are paying attention to it. Lily came in from the barn a few minutes later, covered in dust and hay, with a new fossil in her hand, a long, thin piece of dark stone that she announced might be a piece of a marine creature's shell from the Cretaceous period, with a confidence that suggested she had been reading more of the geologist Newberry's work. She noticed the coin on the windowsill immediately and picked it up and turned it over with the focused interest she brought to all objects of potential significance. "Is this Papa's coin?" she asked, looking at her mother. "Yes," Grace said. Lily looked at it for another moment and then placed it back at the end of the fossil row with the careful precision of someone who understands where things belong. "Good," she said. "It should be here." The summer of 1884, Lily was 12 years old and had outgrown the county school curriculum, and was writing letters to a geological survey organization in Lawrence that had begun, to her considerable and carefully concealed excitement, writing back. Alfred read every letter she received and discussed their contents with her with the seriousness he gave to legal arguments, and Grace watched her daughter's mind unfold like a map of somewhere extraordinary, knowing it would take Lily far from the Creekside claim on the Kishom Trail Road, knowing also that the roots being put down in this ground would travel with her. Thomas was 4 and loud and devoted to the yellow dog, which they had named Sergeant for reasons no one could fully reconstruct, and to the cattle, which he observed from the fence rail with the proprietary interest of a small person who considers large animals his personal domain. Clara was 3 and quiet and curious, and had developed a habit of following Alfred around the farm at a careful distance, not asking for attention, but simply being present, which Alfred had responded to by narrating everything he was doing, explaining fence repairs and cattle management and the operation of the well pump, to an audience of one small solemn girl, and which had resulted in Clara having a vocabulary at 3 that was considerably more technical than average. In the fall of 1885, Grace discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time, and this announcement was received at the kitchen table with the same ceremony as the previous ones, Alfred holding her for a long, warm moment in the lamplight, and Thomas and Clara watching from the other side of the table with expressions that mixed curiosity and mild alarm in equal proportion. The 3rd child, another boy, arrived in the spring of 1886 and was named after Alfred's own father, James, which Alfred had suggested one evening with the same quiet manner in which he suggested all important things, and Grace had said yes immediately because she understood what it meant to name a child after someone you had loved and lost. James Brooks arrived in the world with Clara's considering expression and Thomas's vocal enthusiasm, a combination that suggested his future would be interesting, and was received by his siblings with mixed feelings that resolved, over the course of several weeks, into what would become a complicated and entirely loving sibling dynamic. Thomas appointed himself head of James's physical education and began immediately making plans for teaching him to climb the corral fence. Lily, who was 14 and increasingly adult in her manner, held her smallest brother with the competent tenderness of someone who has watched babies long enough to understand their requirements, and declared him acceptable. The claim was fully theirs by the spring of 1887, the mortgage on the timber addition paid, the land patent recorded and clear, the boundary dispute a legal footnote in the district records, the 40 acres that Calhoun had tried to steal lying peacefully within their fence lines growing good grass. They had 320 acres of prime shortgrass prairie and creek bottomland, 28 head of cattle, a grain operation that was yielding consistently, an orchard just beginning to come into its productive years, 4 children, and a yellow dog who had been with them longer than James had existed and showed no signs of slowing down. On an evening in May of 1887, almost exactly 9 years after a widow had walked into a land office with 1 coin and a cited statute, Grace and Alfred sat on the south porch in the long light of the prairie evening. The orchard trees were blooming, the peach and apple blossoms filling the air with a sweetness that felt like the most lavish thing in the world. The cattle were quiet in the far pasture. Inside the house, Thomas could be heard conducting some kind of energetic negotiation with Sargent, and Clara was reading aloud to James in the slow, careful voice she used for him. And Lily was at the table with her geological survey correspondence, which had recently resulted in an invitation to assist at a summer dig near Dodge City, an invitation Alfred and Grace had already decided to permit despite Lily's being only 15. Because they knew her, and they knew the quality of what she was becoming. Grace held the deed in her hands, not because she needed to, she knew every word of it, but because she had taken it down from the shelf where it lived in its brown envelope, and she was holding it the way you hold something that tells the true story of where you have been. "Do you remember that morning?" she asked. Alfred, who had been watching the last of the light leave the western sky, turned to look at her. "I remember everything about that morning," he said. "I was so frightened," Grace said. "I did not let myself think about being frightened until afterward, but I was." "You did not look frightened," Alfred said. "You looked like someone who had already decided how this was going to go." "I had decided," Grace said. "I just was not certain the world was going to cooperate with my decision." He smiled at her, the real smile that she knew well, the one that meant he was entirely in the moment and entirely here, not managed or careful but plain and warm and open. "It cooperated," he said. "Eventually," Grace allowed. She looked down at the deed. "Because you made it cooperate. By doing the right thing when it would have been easy not to. You made it possible to do the right thing," Alfred said. "You came in with a legal argument that was correct. I only had to recognize that it was correct." "You went and got 3 extra affidavits on your own time," Grace said. "On a Sunday." "It was a thorough argument," he said. "It deserved thorough documentation." Grace laughed. After 9 years, she still laughed at things Alfred said in ways she had not expected to, and she thought that was perhaps the finest thing about him, the way his particular kind of dry and serious humor caught her off guard, which should not have been possible after 9 years but still was. The evening deepened around them, and inside the house, the sounds of children continued their ordinary music, and the orchard released its sweetness into the cooling air, and the Whitfield deed lay in Grace's hands in the last of the light. Its official seal, a dark round shape against the pale heavy paper, and Grace thought about Thomas, who had staked this claim in the faith that something could be built here, and about the 7 months of rented rooms and statutes, and about a coin placed on a counter and a man who had looked at it with those storm-colored eyes and taken the time to think. "Alfred," she said. He said, still watching the sky. "I am happy," she said. Not with the surprise of someone who had not expected it, but with the certainty of someone who has spent a long time knowing what they value and has found, after real cost and real work, that they are in possession of it. Alfred turned and looked at her in the last of the light, and his face was the face of a man who has been loved honestly by a woman who meant everything she said and nothing she did not, and who had found in the life they built together the particular satisfaction of a thing done right. "So am I," he said. He took her hand the way he had always taken it, carefully, unhurriedly, asking rather than assuming, and Grace held on with both of hers, and behind them the house held their children and their life and the yellow dog asleep in the kitchen, and before them the prairie held its enormous quiet, the dark coming in from the east and the last colors fading from the west, and the Kansas stars beginning, one by one, to appear overhead. The deed went back on its shelf the next morning. Lily received her confirmation letter from the Geological Survey 2 days later, and came running from the barn with it clutched in both hands, her hair coming loose from its pins, and the whole family stood in the yard and Alfred read it aloud, while Lily stood with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright. And Thomas asked what a geological survey was, and Clara explained it to him in precise technical detail. And James pulled on the hem of Grace's skirt and pointed at a bird on the fence post. The orchard came into full bearing that summer, the first real harvest of fruit from trees they had planted knowing they would not see them produce for years, and Grace made preserves from the peaches and the apples, and lined them up on the kitchen shelf, where they sat in the amber September light like something out of a story about abundance. Alfred looked at those jars one morning over coffee and said that they were, in his view, the finest things currently on display in the state of Kansas, which was an exaggeration but felt entirely true. Thomas started school that fall with the particular reluctance of a child who had been convinced he already knew everything important, and returned each day with new evidence that there were things he did not know yet, which Grace considered one of the best things the school could have given him. Clara and James occupied the farm with their respective personalities, Clara observing and cataloging, and James naming things loudly. And the yellow dog moved among all of them with the loyalty of something that had chosen its people, and did not intend to revise that choice. The land held them through that year and the next and the ones after, through the good seasons and the hard ones, through all the ordinary extraordinary accumulation of a life well built. The creek ran along the eastern boundary as it always had, clear and reliable, and the cottonwood tree grew broader every year, and the fossil on the windowsill sat in the row with the others, gold among the gray stones, a beginning and not an end. There was a morning in 1888, 10 years after the coin first crossed the counter, when Lily was 16 and preparing for her second summer with the Geological Survey, and Thomas was 8 and had recently decided he intended to raise cattle professionally, and had begun conducting his education in this direction with extreme focus. And Clara was 7 and serious, and already one of the better readers in the county school. And James was 2 and the loudest member of any room he occupied. And Alfred came in from the early morning pasture check with the sun on his shoulders, and the smell of the dew on him, and Grace handed him his coffee, and their hands touched over the cup in the ordinary way. They had touched 10,000 times. He looked at her, she looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "A coin," she said, "and a cold April morning, and a man who looked up from a ledger." Alfred wrapped both hands around the cup and around her hands with it, warm and cert. "I looked up," he said, "and there you were." "There I was," Grace agreed, "with one coin and a plan. The best plan," he said, "I have ever had the privilege of documenting." Outside, the Kansas morning was becoming itself, the light coming up over the flat eastern horizon and spreading westward across the prairie, touching the orchard trees and the barn and the fence lines and the creek cottonwoods and the long grass and all 320 acres of what had been built here, year by year and season by season and hand by hand. A meadowlark started up somewhere in the pasture, the clear 4-note call that Grace had known since her first spring on this land, and that still, every year, made her feel the same bright lift in the chest. James's voice rose from the direction of the bedroom, announcing that he was awake, and Sergeant's nails clicked on the board floor moving toward the sound, and from Lily's room came the sound of her reading, already at her books before breakfast. And the morning was fully underway, warm and real and full of itself, and Grace and Alfred stood in the kitchen in the early light with their hands around the same cup of coffee, and the whole wide life they had made spread out around them, rooted and growing and entirely, completely, irrevocably theirs.